They say the average American senior tells the same story more than 50 times. We roll our eyes. We change the subject. We clear the dishes. But what if one of those repeated stories is not a loop? What if it is a flare in the dark? What if it is the last living key to a door you did not know your family owned? My name is Emily. I am 28. I live in Ohio in a small rented duplex that smells like coffee and laundry soap. My grandmother is Margaret. She is 96. She taught school after the war and still corrects my grammar under her breath. She walks with a cane that clicks like a metronome on the kitchen tile. She tells one story more than any other. She says that when she was a girl at the end of the war, she saved an American soldier. She says she hid him when the world was hunting him. People at our table treat it like a sweet habit. They smile and let their eyes go cloudy. One person always says we have heard this before. Someone checks a phone. Someone offers pie. I used to do the same. I told myself I was being kind by letting her talk while I drifted. I told myself memory repeats like a record with a scratch. It felt harmless. It felt modern. It felt like love that is tidy and fast. But love is not tidy and fast when it sits across from you with age spots on its hands. 2 weeks ago, our family gathered for Sunday dinner. The roast was a little dry and the corn was sweet. The TV in the den was muted but still throwing blue light. Grandma started her story the way she always does. She set her fork down. She folded her hands. She said once there was a night when the wind was so cold, it made the barn board sing. My uncle sighed. He said, "Now, Mom, enough. We've all heard your war fairy tale." His voice was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was smooth. The kind of smooth that can sand a person down. The table chuckled. Chairs creaked. Someone reached for salt. I looked at my grandmother. Her eyes were wet but steady. She nodded like a teacher who has decided not to argue with a class. She lifted her water. She took a careful sip. And then she said a sentence so soft I almost missed it. She said they will never know. It was not pity. It was not anger. It sounded like a door closing somewhere far down a hall. That night, I could not sleep. The sentence kept tapping on my ribs like a branch on a window. They will never know. It made me feel small in a way I did not like. It made me feel like I had walked past a museum in my own house with a sign that said open, and I kept going because I was late to nowhere. The next afternoon, I drove to her place. The sky was a clean blue that makes you think of fresh sheets. I brought cinnamon rolls and a notepad like I was brave. I was not brave. I was just done being smooth. I sat beside her on the floral couch and told her I wanted to hear the story again. All of it, the real way. She looked at me for a long time. I watched the clock hands move. Then she nodded. She said, "If you want the truth, you have to promise me something first." When the people we love stop listening, the truth does not disappear. It waits. It waits for the one person willing to go looking. If you have someone who repeats a story, try asking them to start at the beginning and mean it. You might be the only door that opens. That promise I made to her sat heavy in my chest, like a coin I was afraid to spend. It was Sunday evening again, and our family was gathered for dinner at my parents' house. The smell of roast beef and baked potatoes filled the kitchen, the kind of smell that usually wraps around you like a blanket. But that night, there was a sharpness under it, a tension I hadn't noticed before. Maybe I was just tuned in differently after my talk with Grandma the day before. We all took our seats. My uncle carved the roast, my cousins passed the rolls, my mom poured iced tea. It was the same rhythm we'd danced to for years, and then, like clockwork, Grandma began. She put down her fork, folded her hands, and said, When I was a young girl, the war had just ended. Her voice was soft but sure. My uncle, always the first to interrupt, sighed so loud it made the silverware rattle. "Margaret, enough. We've all heard your war fairy tale," he said, without even looking at her. A few people chuckled. My cousin rolled his eyes. My aunt reached for more butter, like nothing had happened. But I watched Grandma. I saw her lips pressed together in that way she does when she's deciding whether to keep going or not. Her shoulders drew in slightly, like she was tucking her story away where no one could touch it. She took a sip of water, set the glass down with care. And that's when I saw it. Her eyes glistened. Not in a dramatic, attention-seeking way. This was different. It was like watching the light shift inside an old photograph. And then, almost under her breath, she murmured, "They'll never know." No one else at the table noticed. Or maybe they didn't care. They just went back to eating. But I heard it, and it didn't sound like a complaint. It sounded like a truth she'd carried too long. A truth that had decided to stop knocking. The words wrapped around me like a cold wind. My stomach tightened. I wanted to ask her right there what she meant. But the room was too full of clinking silverware and small talk. It would have been like trying to whisper in the middle of a storm. So I just watched her. Every movement. The way she cut her meat into perfect tiny squares. The way her hand trembled slightly when she lifted her fork. The way she kept her gaze down, as if meeting anyone's eyes might give something away. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and everyone scattered to the living room to watch TV, I saw her standing by the hallway, alone. She wasn't moving toward the couch like she usually did. She was just waiting. I walked over. "Grandma," I said quietly, "what did you mean by, 'they'll never know'?" She looked at me. Really looked. Her eyes searched mine the way a teacher searches a student's face for honesty. Then she said, "If you want to know the truth, Emily, go to the top shelf of my closet." I started to speak, but she held up a hand. "Promise me you won't tell them yet." Something in her voice made my skin prickle. It wasn't fear exactly, but there was weight in it. Like whatever was up there could tilt the ground beneath us all. "I promise," I said, though my voice wavered. She gave the smallest nod, then walked away, her cane clicking on the hardwood. I stood there, my heart thudding in my ears, wondering what kind of story had to be hidden on the top shelf of a 96-year-old woman's closet, and why the thought of finding it made me both excited and afraid. I didn't go to her closet right away. All night I kept replaying her voice in my head, the way she had said, "Promise me you won't tell them yet." It was a request, but it carried the weight of an order. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind trying to guess what could possibly be hidden there. A love letter? Family scandal? Some old photographs too personal for anyone else to see? But the way she'd looked at me, it made me think this was bigger than romance or embarrassment. There was a sharpness in her eyes, something that didn't belong to a sweet old woman with a shelf full of porcelain teacups. The next morning, I drove to her house. The wind had picked up, tossing dry leaves across the porch. The sky was the pale kind of gray that makes you pull your coat tighter without thinking. She greeted me in her worn cardigan, her hair pinned up neatly as always. "Emily," she said with a knowing smile, "you're here for the shelf." It wasn't a question. I followed her down the hallway to her bedroom. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. She pointed her cane toward the tall, narrow closet in the corner. "Top shelf, wrapped in the green cloth. Be careful. It's heavier than it looks." My fingers hesitated on the door handle. This felt less like opening a closet and more like breaking into a vault. I pushed the door open. The faint scent of cedar and dust drifted out. Coats hung neatly in a row. Shoes lined up on the floor. Polished, but unworn. And up above, I spotted it, a bundle wrapped in faded green cloth. I dragged over the little wooden step stool she kept tucked in the corner. As I climbed, my heart hammered in my chest. My hands shook, not from the weight, but from the strange certainty that whatever was inside would change something. Maybe everything. I pulled the bundle down. The cloth was rough against my palms, its edges frayed from decades of handling. I set it gently on the bed and began to unwrap it. Inside was an old wooden box, the kind with brass corners and a clasp that had long since dulled. I flicked it open, and the hinges gave a soft groan. The first thing I saw was a neatly folded American flag. Not the small kind they sell at souvenir shops. This was regulation size, folded into a perfect triangle, edges sharp. Underneath it lay a stack of envelopes tied with a thin ribbon, their paper yellowed and fragile. And below those, a small, gleaming medal set in a velvet case. The Silver Star. I recognized it instantly from history books. I picked up the first envelope, careful not to tear it. The handwriting was slanted, hurried, but strong. To Margaret, the woman who saved my life when the world was burning. If I never make it home, know that I died, because you gave me a chance to live. My throat tightened. At the bottom, a signature, a name I had seen before in military archives, on a plaque in a local memorial. A name tied to a soldier who had gone missing in action in 1945. I stared at it, my mind racing. This wasn't a family bedtime story. This was proof. Behind me, Grandma's cane tapped once on the floor. "Now you understand why I said they'll never know," she said softly. "Because no one ever asked." The way she said it sent a chill through me. Not because of the medal or the letter, but because I realized there were more letters under that ribbon. And something told me they weren't all from the same man. My hands felt clumsy as I untied the ribbon holding the letters together. The paper was so brittle that each crease seemed ready to give way. I slid the top one free. The ink had faded, but the words still carried a pulse, as if the man who wrote them was speaking just over my shoulder. "Margaret, it is the third day you've hidden me. I do not know if I will make it out. But you feed me your own bread. You keep watch when I sleep. You treat me like a soldier worth saving. No one has ever done that for me before." I swallowed hard and set it aside. The next letter had darker stains on the corner, like dried rain or tears. They're closer now. I can hear the boots. I am ready if this is it. But if I walk again in my country streets, I will speak your name. I glanced at Grandma. Her eyes were far away, as if she was back in that damp cellar. Then I reached the third letter and stopped breathing. The signature at the bottom was more than familiar. It belonged to a soldier whose face I'd seen in documentaries, in grainy black and white footage shaking hands with generals. A decorated war hero whose disappearance in 1945 had baffled historians for decades. I looked back at the medal in the box. You saved him?" I whispered. Grandma didn't answer right away. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her cane resting beside her, hands folded over her lap. Finally, she said, "I did what anyone with a beating heart would do. But I was 16, and a girl, and not an American citizen. To the military, I didn't exist, so my name never touched a page." I stared at the pile of letters, the flag, the medal. This wasn't just proof. This was a missing chapter of history sitting on a bedspread in a small Ohio home. I reached for another letter, but Grandma put her hand over mine. No more today. Some things need to breathe before they're spoken out loud. If you rush them, you'll break them. There was a weight in her words, but also a warning. Maybe some truths didn't just change the past. They reached out and bent the present too. Why now? I asked. Why show me? She smiled faintly. Because you listened. Everyone else just waits for me to finish so they can talk again. But you stayed. For a moment, I didn't know whether to feel honored or burdened. The letters were still spread out on the bed, the silver catching the afternoon light like a quiet heartbeat. I looked at her, really looked, and realized something that made my chest ache. She hadn't been repeating a story all these years. She'd been keeping it alive. Because once it stopped being told, it would vanish. And maybe that was the real reason she chose me. Not because I was special, but because I was the last one willing to carry it. Some truths aren't just family secrets. They're pieces of history no one bothered to ask about. And if you're lucky enough to be the one holding it in your hands, you have to decide, will you keep it safe, or will you finally set it free? I came back the next afternoon. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want to give her the chance to change her mind. She was sitting in her armchair by the window, the letters stacked neatly on the side table as if they'd been waiting for me. Are you ready for the rest? She asked, her voice even. I nodded, and she began. It was late winter, 1945, she said, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the glass. Our village was small, too small to matter to most soldiers. But the war had a way of finding every corner. That night, the snow came down in wet sheets. My father was out in the barn, and I was hauling water from the well when I heard it. Footsteps that didn't belong to anyone from here. She leaned back, her hands gripping the armrests. He was leaning against the fence post, bleeding through his coat. I knew enough English to understand when he said, "Help." His voice was shaking, not from cold, but from running. Her eyes narrowed slightly, remembering. The Germans weren't far. You could hear their dogs. I didn't think. I grabbed him by the arm and pulled him toward the cellar. We had a small space beneath the kitchen where we kept potatoes. I hid him there, covered him with burlap sacks, and locked the hatch. She told me how she smuggled him food, thin slices of bread, a cup of water at a time, while her parents pretended not to know. How she lied to the soldiers who banged on their door, saying she was alone with her mother. How one of them, suspicious, pushed past her and searched the kitchen. I stood right over the hatch while they looked, she said. If they'd opened it, they'd have shot us both. On the third night, she told him it was safe to go. She gave him her father's coat and pointed him toward the woods. Before he left, he pressed something into her hand, a patch from his uniform, stitched with his unit's number. I thought I'd never see him again, she said. And then, months later, I got the first letter. He was alive. He'd made it back to his unit, and he kept writing, until one day, the letter stopped. I leaned forward. Stopped? Why? She hesitated. Because he was gone again, this time for good. His unit said he went missing on a mission in the Ardennes. They gave him medals after, called him a hero. But in all their speeches, they never said my name. I wasn't on any roster. I was just a village girl who had done what needed to be done. I looked at the silver star gleaming in the box. He must have sent this before he... She nodded. Yes, with a note asking me to keep it until the world was ready to know the whole story. But I never told it outside this family, and they... Her voice tightened. They didn't care to listen. Her words hit harder than I expected. She wasn't angry about being forgotten by history. She was hurt by being forgotten by her own. That was the real wound, and it had been open for 70 years. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. And in that stillness, I realized something. Her story wasn't just about saving a soldier. It was about the cost of silence. Some people think heroism is a moment. Sometimes it's a lifetime of carrying something no one else will. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about her words, the cost of silence. I thought about how many dinners we'd had where the story hovered in the air like smoke, ignored until it faded. By the next Sunday, I'd made up my mind. If no one in this family wanted to listen, then I would make them listen. When we all sat down for dinner, I carried the green-wrapped bundle into the dining room. No one paid attention at first. The roast was steaming, my cousins were scrolling on their phones, and the TV in the next room hummed softly. I waited until everyone had food on their plates. Then I stood. "I have something to share," I said. My uncle sighed. "Emily, can this wait until after we eat?" "No," I said, my voice steady. "It can't." I set the bundle on the table and began to unwrap it. First came the flag, perfectly folded. The room went still. Then the letters, stacked in their ribbon. And finally, the medal in its velvet case. "What is this?" my cousin asked, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. "This," I said, picking up the top letter, "is the truth, the one you've all been too busy to hear." I read the first letter aloud. My voice shook at first, but it got stronger with each line. I watched my family's faces change. Confusion, then surprise, then something else entirely when I spoke the name at the bottom of the page. By the time I finished, the room was silent. My grandmother sat with her eyes closed, her hands folded. I placed the medal in the center of the table. "She saved his life. He was a war hero, and none of you knew because none of you listened." For a long moment, no one moved. Then my uncle, the same man who'd cut her off so many times, pushed back his chair and stood. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "I've seen that photo before," he said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "What photo?" I asked. He looked at Grandma. "The one of you and the soldier?" "I found it in a drawer when I was a teenager. I asked you about it, and you told me. But—" He trailed off. "But what?" I pressed. He swallowed hard. "Dad didn't like hearing about it. Said it made him feel like less of a man. Like he couldn't measure up to the danger you faced, so I—" He stopped, staring at the floor. I pretended it didn't exist, and I guess I made sure no one else cared either. The words landed like a slap. I looked at Grandma. Her face was calm, but her eyes were brighter than usual. "I always wondered if it was him," she said softly. "Now I know." No one spoke after that. My uncle walked out of the room without another word. The rest of us just sat there, staring at the medal, the letters, the flag. They seemed heavier now, not because they had changed, but because we had. I glanced at Grandma. She gave me the smallest nod, as if to say, "This is what the truth looks like when it finally sees daylight." It had been a week since that dinner. The letters and the medal were back in Grandma's closet, but the air in our family had shifted. Nobody interrupted her anymore, though she wasn't telling the story either. It was as if everyone was waiting for the next move. I was at work on a Tuesday morning when my phone rang. The number was from California. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was trembling, like he was holding back a tide. "Is this Emily, Margaret's granddaughter?" "Yes," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "My name is Thomas," he said slowly. Thomas Reed, my father, he named me after a woman named Margaret. He told me she saved his life in the war. I froze. The name Reed? It was the same last name signed at the bottom of those letters. I think your grandmother might be the Margaret my father talked about all his life, Thomas continued. He said she was a young girl who hid him from the Germans. He didn't give details, just that without her, he wouldn't have come home. I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me. She remembers you? I said quietly. Or your father. There was silence, and then a shaky breath on the other end. I've been looking for her for years. When I found your number, I almost didn't believe it. But I have something that belongs to her. My father left it to me, with instructions to return it to Margaret if I ever found her. What is it? I asked. A photograph, he said, of the two of them, taken the day he left her village. It's the only picture I have of him smiling in uniform. I couldn't speak for a moment. The idea that somewhere, thousands of miles away, a photograph existed to prove that moment was real. It made the hair on my arms stand up. I'd like to meet her, Thomas said. I want to thank her myself, before it's too late. We made arrangements for him to fly to Ohio, but before we hung up, he added something that made my chest tighten. There's going to be a small ceremony at the National Museum of the United States Army next month. They're adding a section about civilians who risked their lives in the war. I've spoken to the curator. They want her to be there. When I told Grandma, she just looked at me for a long time. Then she smiled, but it wasn't the light smile of politeness. It was the kind that came from somewhere deep, like a spring finally finding daylight. 78 years, she said softly. I thought no one would ever knock on that door again. In that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just about honoring her. It was about giving history back its missing pieces. The day Thomas arrived, the air felt different. It was a crisp morning, the kind where the sky is a sharp, endless blue, and the sunlight seems to land softer on everything it touches. I drove to Grandma's house early, partly because I didn't want her to be alone when the doorbell rang, but mostly because I wanted to witness it. The moment two pieces of a story, separated by decades and continents, would finally be put back together. Grandma was already dressed when I got there. She wore a simple navy dress, her silver hair pinned back neatly, and the little brooch she always saved for important days. She didn't ask me to help her get ready. She didn't fidget or fuss. She just sat in her chair by the window, her cane resting against her knee, her eyes far away but steady. When the knock finally came, I think my heart was beating louder than hers. I opened the door to find Thomas standing there, a tall man in his 70s, his hair white at the temples, holding a small wooden frame in his hands like it was made of glass. His eyes went past me almost instantly, searching the room until they landed on her. He stepped inside slowly, as if crossing some invisible threshold. "Margaret?" he said. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm but warm. He handed her the frame without another word. She took it in her hands and just stared. It was the photograph he had promised, her 16-year-old face wrapped in a scarf, standing beside a young soldier with a bandaged arm. They were both smiling, but there was something in their eyes that went deeper than joy, something like survival. "I never thought I'd see this again," she whispered. Thomas sat across from her, his hands folded. "He told me about you my whole life, how you hid him, fed him, stood between him and death. He said the world moved on, but he never did. He said his life was built on the days you gave him." Grandma looked at him for a long moment before speaking. He was brave, and he was kind. But the truth is, Thomas, I didn't do it for a medal or a thank you. I did it because it was the right thing, because no one else was there. They talked for hours about the letters, about his father's life after the war, about how he had always wanted to find her, but didn't have the pieces until now. Every so often, I caught Grandma looking at him with a mix of wonder and something else, maybe relief. A week later, we stood together at the National Museum of the United States Army. The silver star rested in its velvet case inside a glass display alongside the folded flag, copies of the letters, and the photograph Thomas had brought. The plaque read, "In recognition of civilians whose courage saved American lives during World War II. Margaret, last name, age 16, sheltered and aided a wounded soldier at great personal risk." I watched strangers pause at the display, reading the words, leaning closer to see the photograph. Some smiled. Some shook their heads in disbelief. And I realized something. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who stood there, to everyone who let it change the way they saw the world. That night, after the ceremony, I drove Grandma home. She was quiet most of the way, her hands resting in her lap, the medal now in its rightful place. As I pulled into her driveway, she finally spoke. "Emily," she said softly, "thank you for listening." I turned to her. "I'm sorry it took me so long." She smiled. "Better late than never. And now, they'll know." We sat there in the car for a moment, the cool night air drifting through the open window. I thought about how close this story came to disappearing, how easily it could have been packed away in a closet forever, wrapped in green cloth, waiting for someone who cared enough to reach for it. We think we're doing our elders a favor by listening politely, but sometimes we're the ones who need to hear their stories. Because once they're gone, so are the pieces of history they carry. And here's the thing. Not every truth comes wrapped in medals and letters. Some are tucked into small moments, an old recipe, a worn photograph, a place name said with a certain tone. They might seem ordinary, but if you lean in, if you really listen, you might realize you're holding a thread that connects you to something much bigger than yourself. So the next time you hear a story you think you've heard before, ask yourself, what if this is the last time it will ever be told? What if you're the only person standing between it and silence? Because one day, when the voice is gone and the chair is empty, you'll wish you had asked them to tell it again, and again, and again. Some stories aren't meant to be shortened. They're meant to be carried. And sometimes, carrying them is the most important thing you will ever do.